Hello and welcome back to the Insights of NetSupport podcast, corporate edition, where we'll be speaking to different professionals about areas of their expertise and getting some insights, hopefully, hence the name. So I'm really excited today to be welcoming Hatty onto the show. Hi, Hatty, how are you?
Hello, Kat. Very well, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for coming. How's your week been so far?
It has been pretty busy. The usual cramming of extra work into every day before Christmas, but it's good. Thank you. Yes, and yours?
Yeah, similar really. Just trying to, like you say, get things done before it inevitably all winds down a little bit for Christmas. So
yes,
all good fun. So perfect. So before we kind of get into the podcast, would you mind just introducing yourself to our listeners, please?
Thank you. My name is Hatty McCafferty. I'm a qualified and certified menopause consultant, which means that I go into organizations to make them menopause attractive. I'm also a qualified PT, a nutrition coach, health and wellness coach, and yoga teacher. So I've got the background that helps me along supporting midlife women, or it tends to be midlife women. We'll get into that in a bit, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that might feed into some of the misconceptions and things that we're going to talk about. So that's a really interesting background, Hatty. So before we kind of get into, obviously, because we're going to be talking a lot about menopause, can you start by explaining what that is in a nutshell for anyone that's not really sure?
In a nutshell, it's become a term for midlife generally in social speak. Menopause itself is actually one single day. So then people dash off and wonder what on earth all the fuss is about. But what menopause marks is the 12-month anniversary after the end of a woman's last period. So really you can only diagnose it retrospectively. Perimenopause, which is the run-up to menopause, can last from 4 to 12 years. So that's really where the conversation has begun. And menopause, once it's happened, you enter your post-menopausal life, and that is the rest of your life. So rather than thinking, oh, menopause, it's the end. Yes, it's an end of a section of your life, of your technically reproductive years, but it is the beginning of the rest of your life. And so encouraging women, encouraging everybody, but specifically, and I will use the term women because that tends to be the majority of the population who we're talking to at the moment. But again, we'll get onto that. Encouraging them to look positively at this next section of their life. So technically, menopause is the marking of the end of a woman's reproductive years. It's one day, but the conversation spans from 12 years before that to the rest of their life.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Hattie, for clarifying that. I think that's really important. So feeding into that then, what are some of the symptoms that women might experience during their perimenopause?
There are 72 currently recognized symptoms. Yeah, so it makes it very difficult. Enormous, particularly given that many of the online questionnaires, which are very helpful, certainly as a place to begin when you're trying to work out what's going on with yourself, they only have maybe 21 to 34 of the symptoms.
Right.
And I won't list them because we will be here a long time, but I'll give you a broad idea of things to work out or things to look out for. Often it can start with erratic periods, but this isn't always the first sign. I think the commonly recognized ones might be hot flashes and night sweats, but again, not everybody has these. So there's a great deal of nuance in menopause. It's very individual. Just as every human is individual in every other way, the symptoms are also individual. And yet universal because we may experience a number of them. I went through, I think, 50 of them in a workshop recently, just on a personal level, so people knew what I was experiencing. And there were only 13 that I haven't had, but not all at once. So they could range from tinnitus to heart palpitations, an additional oversensitivity to sound, night sweats, hot flashes, erratic periods, flooding periods, dizziness, brain fog, memory lapse, anxiety and depression. So they can range from the smaller, again, itchy skin, a sensation of having ants crawling over your skin, dry eyes. They seem like little symptoms to the greater, broader, often psychological symptoms. And yet, when you add them together, they can be really debilitating. And if you take insomnia, for example, we all know how it feels having a bad night's sleep, a bad week's sleep, a bad month's sleep, and then interspersed in the evening, or in the night, if you are having insomnia, often that's accompanied by hot flashes at night or night sweats. So they compound, and then you wake up and you have to be on form, have information at your fingertips the next day, whether you're at home or at work, and the brain fog comes in, and it's even worse if you haven't slept. So cumulatively, it can be a very, very, very challenging time. And something that I've found recently as well is that just as you think you're on top of your symptoms and you're doing well, a certain level of stress can bring them all back tenfold. So it's a really good time to look after yourself for a myriad of reasons, for longevity and for health span, of course, but also to keep the symptoms at bay as much as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So building on that, what are some common misconceptions about menopause, and I should say perimenopause and post-menopause as well then?
So many. Well, one of the things that people are most surprised about is the range of menopauses. So the one that we will talk about today, because it is arguably the most broad spectrum, is the natural menopause, that every assigned female at birth human will go through. So 51% of the population will go through menopause. So one of the misconceptions is that it's a bad thing. I spoke to a lovely man the other day. I think it was about a phone contract. He asked what I did. I told him. He said, "Oh, I have a daughter. I hope she never goes through that." And I had to very gently explain to him that, no, you do. It's okay. It is a challenging period of life for many. Not everybody will experience symptoms. Most will, and they will be of varying degrees, and they will fluctuate over this, let's say, 10-year period. So you might have smaller symptoms, then bigger ones. They might come in waves. It's a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole sometimes, and you deal with one and another one pops up. They change over time. And I've lost my train of thought, which is classic perimenopause. So yes, the misconception of it being a bad thing, actually entering this next phase of life can bring a huge sense of renewal, of purpose and self, and you begin to feel as though you care less about the small stuff. So the importance of life begins to feature, and it can be a very empowering time. Another misconception is that, yes, it is just natural menopause. There is surgical menopause, there's early, there's premature, and there's trans. So whilst they all have similar symptoms and similar ranges, they can be experienced in a very different way. And finally, I suppose people do assume still that it's just hot flashes. And it's, oh yeah, one of the things I heard the other day, it's an old lady disease. So bearing in mind, I know, delightful for a start.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that you can have early or premature, it isn't age specific.
And disease is definitely the wrong term.
Not a disease. It isn't just old women, it's not a disease. And certainly nowadays, everyone I've spoken to for my podcast and my cohort and all the women I've met, they're not this sad, rather grey, faded looking image that people still have of menopause. So one of the aims that we all have when we work in the menosphere is to eradicate the taboo, because I think a lot of people still find it very difficult to talk about bodily functions. Periods much easier than certainly when I was in my teenage years,
Yeah.
but menopause, it's still looked at as a bit of a shabby area. So we should be able to
Still
talk
quite
about it.
stigmatized, isn't it?
It is, yes. And then when you couple that with mental health issues potentially as well, people really like to brush it under the carpet. And I understand where that's coming from. Certainly Gen X, we shove tampons up our sleeves so nobody knows that we're having our periods. We don't like to ask other people for them. We hide the tampons in the supermarket underneath the cabbages and the apples. But, you know, we're trying not to do that now as well and make it all just much more acceptable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned as well that obviously there are different forms of menopause other than natural menopause. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm not an expert on the other forms, but surgical menopause happens when somebody has a hysterectomy or oophorectomy, for example, and they are plunged straight away, literally overnight, depending on the amount of their organs that are removed into menopause. And some of them, it can hit them like a truck. So they need special support.
Of course.
Early menopause is really just when it happens. So the average age is supposedly 45 for perimenopause start and 51 for menopause. But this has a huge range, and cultural impact, cultural background has an impact as well. So women of color, Asian women, Latina women, for example, may start much earlier, and their symptoms might be more intense, particularly when it comes to the vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes. So early. Premature would be one lovely girl who I met recently at a menopause convention, started menopause at 13. So that would definitely be classified as premature. And had POI and PCOS, which are certainly, now this is where I'm not qualified to explain fully. These are conditions that can impact the timing of perimenopause and menopause, certainly. And then finally, trans. So a person who's assigned female at birth who transitions to be a man because of the heavy levels of testosterone. And testosterone is a female hormone as well as estrogen and progesterone. But because of the very, very intense levels of testosterone, they will also enter into menopause. And should they choose to then have a hysterectomy at some point as well, again, that will impact them and
trigger it
bring
as
them
well.
into menopause. Yeah, exactly.
Of course. Yeah, thank you. How can menopause impact on women in the workplace?
The most common symptoms that are troublesome at work tend to be insomnia, anxiety, memory loss, and brain fog, and often flooding as well. Nobody that I know, and do you know what? I very rarely say nobody. Often it's many people because there are exceptions, but I'm going to say nobody in this situation. Nobody wants to feel as though they are bleeding out in front of their colleagues or friends. It is a personal part of the month where you often feel a little bit more introverted anyway. But to bleed through your clothes, maybe onto the chair, particularly if you don't have a change of clothes, can feel really humiliating. So that can happen at any time and come on very, very suddenly and completely without warning. The insomnia, again, as we mentioned earlier, we all know how awful it can feel when you just haven't slept, particularly for a period of time. And if you're working in a high pressure environment and words just fall out of your head, and they don't need to be neuroscientific terms, they can be your colleagues' names or avocado, chair, you know, the basic words that we all know. They can just disappear from your mind. And as I have already demonstrated, the loss of track of thought and concentration, you can feel, or a person can feel like a real fool, no matter how experienced they are. And if you're standing up and giving a big presentation, or perhaps you're in court, or perhaps working in the medical industry, being on the ball is something that a lot of people take pride in and is really essential to the job. So those are the most troublesome. Hot flashes do feature as well, particularly if you're feeling overwhelmed by them and feel as though you are sweating through your clothes in a meeting, for example. That can feel very uncomfortable as well. So learning to dress for that, and frankly, learning to own it, which is why making the whole subject an easier, more approachable conversational topic really, really helps, because then somebody can admit and say, oh, well, that word's fallen out of my head, or, oh, excuse me, I'm just having a hot flash. And it doesn't need to be a big deal. You don't need to draw attention to yourself, and people can just carry on around you or support you and perhaps open a window or give you a glass of water without that feeling condescending. So it's the understanding that then helps with these most common symptoms. There are plenty more, but those are the ones that are discussed most, particularly when I visit workplaces.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And with things like kind of that loss of train of thought and things like that as well, it must be really frustrating because you know what you want to communicate and it's just gone.
No, it's a horrible feeling. It really is. Fortunately, in my line of work, people are very forgiving, and we end up playing a game of charades or something like that in order to find the missing word.
Yeah, absolutely. So onto that, then you said actually that maybe the colleagues around can support you, especially if those conversations are quite open. So what reasonable adjustments could employers be making to support women who are going through the menopause?
It very much depends on the workplace. So if you're working in a factory or in a medical environment, it's going to be very different from, say, a C-suite office. So perhaps in a factory, if you're wearing a uniform, being able to have toilet breaks more often with a change of uniform and multiple changes of uniform is a huge, huge benefit to many women. If you're in a C-suite environment, it's really just being understood and supported, because these women, again, using the broad example, they're very experienced no matter what area of work they hold. They are very valuable. They have work experience. They have life experience, which is quite often an underrated, underestimated skill. So they know how to diffuse difficult situations. They know how to prioritize. They know themselves better, so they know their strengths and how to play into those for working situations as well. So it's really being understood, supported, and encouraged to lean into their strengths and to know that, yes, this will pass. So having said earlier, yes, the perimenopause can last from 4 to 12 years, and then you've still got postmenopausal symptoms to deal with. They can come to an end, and they can certainly lessen. The reason is hormonal. So when you're in premenopause, you have a fairly steady, I mean, it looks like a roller coaster, but fairly steady ebb and flow of your key sex hormones. In perimenopause, there is no rhyme or reason. It is all over the place. Postmenopause, the hormones decline and come to a resting point. So it's during that decline, before the resting point, that there still may be symptoms. And even the occasional one might pop up for the rest of your life, but they won't be as severe. They will be much more manageable, and you'll have an idea of how to handle them and when they're going to happen, because you get little signals. And again, it's down to experience. So looking after the menopausal cohort is extremely important.
Absolutely. And speaking of looking after the cohort, what are some of the foundations of taking care of yourself during this transition?
I use a 5 Fs system, which needs a far better name. I'm not happy with the name at all, but it helps everybody remember what it is. So stress is number 1. Stress management will reduce your symptoms. And once you've got on top of them, if you can continue to manage your stress, then you're going to be in a much better position. Like I said right at the beginning, the minute you have a stressful situation, it's very common for them all to come back tenfold.
Yeah.
So just to keep on top of your stress levels, whatever that looks like to you. And that doesn't have to be meditation or breath work if that's not for you, but working out a way, maybe walking in nature. Maybe if you're not in nature, then walking around the block, just taking some time out, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you can afford. Maybe it's exercise, whatever decompresses you is going to be beneficial. Sleep is the second one. It's so easy to say, well, you need to sleep better. And that's much, much simpler when it can be quite complex. But there are simple things to put in place. Sleep hygiene, so no screens for an hour before bed, which I'm sure pretty much everybody is familiar with. Eating a little bit earlier before you go to bed. It doesn't have to be 6 o'clock. If you're a sort of Mediterranean style, you prefer to go out at 8 or 9, but just bringing it slightly earlier away from your bedtime can often help. Sleeping in a cool room, changing the lighting, making sure you get bright sunshine and daylight first thing in the morning so your body knows to wake up. And again, that's quite difficult in the Northern Hemisphere, but there are very reasonable lights that you can buy, the sad lights that give you assimilated daylight. There are all sorts of techniques, reducing caffeine, reducing alcohol, I'm sorry to say. It doesn't have to be eliminated completely, but being aware of how it affects you is really key. So then you can make your informed choices, whether you want that extra cup of coffee in the morning or whether you want to have a drink in the evening. So that's foundational. Nutrition, eating well, whole foods, plenty of protein, plenty of green cruciferous vegetables. In fact, all the colors of vegetables that you can get your hands on. So protein to maintain muscle mass, healthy fats to maintain brain function, and the fiber from the veggies so that you are continually eliminating any excess hormones that you don't need, because that can be another element of difficulty. So looking after yourself from the inside out. It is such a cliche, but it's very true. Food is medicine. And so first port of call, really. Then we have strength. As we age, all of us worldwide, I believe, we tend to lose muscle mass. And so resistance training or strength training or weightlifting, depending on how you feel about it, is going to be key to build up and certainly at very least maintain your muscle mass, because none of us want to be frail. We all need to improve our bone density from our mid-30s onwards as well. So skeletal health, bone health, muscle health, brain health, it all comes into movement. So making sure that you are strengthening your physical body to support the rest of you as well. And then it's down to self or sex, depending on the environment in which you find yourself. If it's work, then that's not going to feature. So self-care, making sure that you take time out for yourself to manage your stress and manage your caffeine and alcohol and all that kind of thing, pushing yourself further up the list. We often tend to look after other people, whether it's in the workplace or at home. And what we really need to do is look after ourselves first, so that then we can still be in a good, solid position to look after other people around us. It can be a very busy time of life if you have children and parents who need looking after and work. And with the world as it is at the moment, that's a lot. So really taking time out to do something you enjoy. So being with friends, that would be kind of the other fifth S, is the support. Making sure you have a network and a community, almost particularly at work. If you're really struggling at work, finding a community. One of the most successful strategies that has been implemented across the board is creating a menopause hub where people can go, and they don't even have to talk about menopause, but knowing they're in an environment where people understand firsthand, they just know what you're going through. It can halve the stress almost instantly. So having your support network is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on a personal note, what is it that makes you so passionate about menopause and supporting women with that?
It comes from two directions. First of all, I had no idea what was going on with me when perimenopause started. I was completely clueless, and whilst my symptoms weren't severe, they were very confusing to me. I didn't know what was happening. I also, on my personal training side, I was training a lot of menopausal women, and they would talk to me about it, but I wouldn't fully understand it. So I started to study it, really so I could support them better. And then as that world opened up, I learned more. Since then, I broke my face, and it turns out that it was all hormonal, but it took me a year to unpick that. So I woke up one morning, 6 o'clock on a Friday. Lots of people say, "Oh, were you drunk?" Thank you, people. No, it was 6 a.m. And my days of partying until 6 o'clock in the morning are long behind me. And I got up, went to wash my face, felt dizzy, sat down, got up again. And the next thing I remember, I'm sitting on the bed, phoning my husband, who's downstairs feeding the cats and the dog, not making any sense, apparently. So he comes upstairs, thinks I'm having a stroke. Anyway, it turns out through a long process and a very, very black bruised left side of my face that I'd fallen and broken my cheekbone and orbital bone. So I now have metal plates in my face. I met a woman recently who's in New Zealand. The exact same thing had happened to her. We're both personal trainers. We both eat well, or believe we do. We both have 2 kids. We're both perimenopausal. It was both in the morning, both, I mean, so similar. And we, between us, have worked out that it is simply the power of hormones. And I've spoken to a supplement specialist since. If you have, for example, a sudden rise in testosterone, you can become very dizzy if you have a similar drop in estrogen. And this can happen at any time in perimenopause. And so the likelihood is that happened to both of us. It's just, I had no idea it could be so impactful. So the power of hormones is something that I feel everybody needs to be aware of.
Definitely. Yeah, it must have been quite frightening, not really understanding what was going on.
It was very unsettling. And certainly with the broken face, that was hideous. And the recovery for 6 months, that was very hard. But, you know, you learn from these things. So, and everything, fingers crossed, touch wood, is all right now. So, you know, it could have been worse. That's the other thing. It could have been worse. So if people are aware, then they can hopefully manage their symptoms better and be safe with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. So kind of moving out a bit further, how can men be menopause allies?
I think the really simple thing is to just listen. They could do some research for themselves if they believe somebody they know is going through perimenopause in particular, and find out as much as they can. I would definitely say that the more education they have, which is where when I see people in their offices, they kind of gain an advantage. The more they know, the more they can support. They don't need to fix anything. It's not a fixable situation. And many of them are so keen just to make it right, which is lovely. It's very thoughtful and kind and sympathetic. The best thing to do is to listen, to give somebody a bit of space, to be understanding. Sometimes, particularly if it's your partner, they might need some mental space, some physical space, just to work things out for themselves. And to show that you are really, really willing to listen to what they need, because their needs might be changing at this point. And it might be just for a period of time, or it might be a long-term shift. So to keep the conversation open is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Hattie. My last question really is just, where can listeners best get in touch with you and learn more?
The podcast is a good place to start. And I think we're on 105 episodes, something like that now.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really good,
Congrats.
good resource. Thanks. You know how much work that can be. But I've been so fortunate to meet so many amazing people, from graphic designers to professors to doctors to artists and authors. So it's actually a good resource if you just want to kind of dip in and find out what somebody's experience might have been, and for solutions. That's Real Menopause Talk, wherever you choose to get your podcasts. And then my website, which will be up and running in its refreshed form by the end of December 2023, which is also realmenopausetalk.com. I'm pretty active on Instagram, Real Menopause Talk, and on LinkedIn as Hatty McCafferty.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Hattie. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Kat. It's been lovely to meet you.